Hello, my name is Marianne Farkas. I am the director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center on Psychiatric Rehabilitation and the director of training at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University. On behalf of the center and the Consumer Organization and Networking Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as CONTACT, the Rehabilitation Counseling Program at Sargent College, and our domestic affiliate, BCPR Consulting, I want to welcome you to the keynote address of the Conference on Innovations in Recovery and Rehabilitation, the Decade of the Person. This conference was held on October 24th to 26th of 2002 and was attended by over 600 participants representing 20 countries from around the world, from New Zealand to the Middle East and everywhere in between. It is with pleasure that I welcome all of you viewing this webcast to the global community of those interested in the topic area of recovery and rehabilitation. This webcast is presented with support from two important American federal government agencies: the Center for Mental Health Services, CMHS, a component of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDR, a component of the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services. I want to take a moment to talk about these organizations. CMHS, especially through its community support program headed by Neil Brown, has been a leader in the development of two critical threads that have shaped mental health services over the past 25 years: the development of community support programs across the United States, dedicated to serving individuals with serious mental illnesses, and the development of an active consumer voice in the United States. Without the long-term commitment and willingness to take well-founded risks in the development of these two threads, we would not be standing here today talking to you about the concept of recovery. The material and moral leadership shown by CMHS in helping to create an array of services designed to facilitate individuals living in the community, and the leadership demonstrated in supporting the constituency of consumers or ex-patients in becoming active participants, along with family members and others, in the ongoing debate about the vision of mental health services in America, prepared the ground for the discussion we will be having today. NIDR is equally to be commended and acknowledged for its leadership in the area of rehabilitation research and the translation of that research into usable tools for researchers, providers, administrators, and consumers and their families. NIDR, under its past leadership and the present leadership of Stephen Tingus, has provided a role model for other agencies of an organization that took consumer involvement seriously. It has both professionals with and without disabilities within its ranks, indeed at the very helm of the organization. Furthermore, instead of being tied to traditional research paradigms, it has supported the type of groundbreaking and developmental research so necessary to beginning to understand the process of rehabilitation and recovery. It has encouraged and funded participant action research in which consumers themselves help to shape the research questions, design, conduct, and interpret the research. The Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation itself owes a debt of gratitude to these funding bodies for being willing to support an innovation in mental health and rehabilitation, and the long, slow process of building a body of knowledge that can be shared by the field as a whole so that the vision of recovery and rehabilitation will be realized. I now have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Bill Anthony. For those who may not know him, William Anthony, the Executive Director of the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation, has been acknowledged many times as a pioneer and leader in the field of rehabilitation and recovery. Bill has written over 100 articles and 14 textbooks over the past 30 years, including, of course, that most distinguished of all recent titles, The Art of Napping, followed by The Art of Napping at Work. Seriously, though, Bill has received many awards in his career, including the Distinguished Services Award from the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill in 1988, in recognition of his efforts that challenge outdated ideas which limit the potential of individuals with mental illnesses. And second, the Distinguished Service Award from the President of the United States for his efforts in promoting the dignity, equality, independence, and employment of people with disabilities. His latest award was the Fordyce Award, given in 2002 by the World Association of Psychosocial Rehabilitation. While Bill Anthony has made many contributions through his research and writings, the essence of his contribution to the field for the past 30 years can best be described in a quote from Robert Kennedy, paraphrasing George Bernard Shaw. Some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and say, why not? Bill's vision of things that never were has always focused us on the fundamental cornerstone of rehabilitation and recovery. That is, that we are, with or without psychiatric histories, all human beings with the same hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Today's talk is entitled The Decade of the Person and the Walls That Divide Us. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my distinguished colleague and boss, William Anthony.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Thank you, and thank you for coming. What I'm going to do today, of course, is kind of do a repeat of a talk that I gave at our conference. And because of that, because of the need to do a repeat, I wrote it out, which is unusual for me. If those of you who've heard me speak before know I usually speak from cards, note cards, and kind of ad-lib to the cards. Well, today I knew I would have to give this talk, which I gave a week ago, again. So I wrote it out. And the advantage of that, I find, is that you will be able to get copies of this talk off the web, I guess, or something, with references to, as well. And there are certain things, of course, that may be in the written text that I may not talk about here today because they get a little lengthy. So at any rate, let's begin by talking about the walls that divide us, the decade of the person. Over 1 decade ago, I was asked in a psychiatric rehabilitation journal editorial to suggest what we might call this coming decade because it had been called the decade of the brain. And I thought, well, let's call it something else too. And I said, let's call it the decade of recovery. And I did that because based on the writings of people such as Deegan and Chamberlain, who certainly presented at the conference, along with a number of other people who talk about recovery and their own recovery, as well as the writings of Courtney Harding, who talked about the empirical basis for recovery, I thought that this decade could be aptly named the decade of recovery. Well, having done that once, I was asked again at the beginning of this century, in this new decade, well, what are you going to call this decade? And once again, I wrote an editorial in the Psychiatric Rehab Journal, and I said, well, let's call this decade the decade of the person. And I chose this term because I believe that we as a field had really forgotten that we're dealing with people here, or we tend to forget that at times. And that like traditional medicine, sometimes we talk about people as if they were their diagnoses. So that in traditional medicine, we talk about a person as if they were the damaged heart, or the cancerous breast, or the arthritic back. And that in our field, we would talk about people as if they were the dysfunctional brain. And obviously, people are a lot more than that. But I think all of healthcare has become kind of what I would say more specialized, and they treat people in terms of their special diagnoses. To me, this partitioning of the person into body parts or into diagnoses is part of a legacy in this field that we seem to have developed over the last several decades of separating people by diagnoses or separating people from one another. And that indeed is what I want to talk about today, how we have put up walls that separate us from each other and indeed from our own selves. And I'm going to do this by quoting a person outside the mental health arena who has written eloquently about the danger of erecting walls that divide us. And those of you who've heard me speak before know that I often like to quote Robert Frost, one of my favorite American poets. And he wrote a poem called Mending Wall. Mending Wall. And in it he describes essentially 2 farmers walking down their stone wall on each side, which was the fence between their properties, and picking up stones that had been knocked over by the frost and so forth, and rebuilding their fence as they went along, mending their wall. All right. Well, there are a number of lines in that poem that are very, very important and very critical to me, and they describe more than just the pastures and fields of Vermont. They really describe our field. And there's a couple of lines in there that I always seem to come back to. One is the line that says, something there is that doesn't love a wall. And there's another line in there that I like, which is, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or out. Well, I'm going to be quoting other lines from Frost's poem, but the poem is the starting point, really, of my talk today. And I wish to speak today in Frost's own home of New England about the field of mental health and the things that continue to wall us in or wall us out from ourselves and from one another. Over 30 years ago, I started in this field of at the time was a brand new field of psychiatric rehabilitation. And in retrospect, my first job was to tear down some walls. I was a captain in the United States Army stationed at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in D.C., in Washington, D.C. And I was a psychologist working at the Walter Reed General Hospital. And we treated soldiers returning from Vietnam who were either had neurological problems or psychiatric problems. The title of our department was the Department of Psychiatry and Neurology. And we treated those individuals very differently. If you had neurological problems, say spinal cord injury or traumatic brain injury, we developed a rehabilitation team of all the professionals, and we met with the soldier and talked about their own rehabilitation and what they might expect, what they might want to do, etc. The wards on which neurological patients were housed, where there's just seemed to be a lot of respect and empathy on those wards. And then there was the people who were labeled at that time the mentally ill, who had returned from Vietnam with mental disorders. And those people were treated very differently. We didn't have a rehabilitation team for those soldiers. We essentially had medication, little occupational therapy, and that was the extent of the treatment at that time. So while they were in the same hospital, they were really divided by a wall, both figuratively and literally. And it was very, very different types of treatment that those different soldiers got. So when I left the Army, I returned to civilian life as a teacher and a researcher, and my thought was this: does this disparity that we experience when people with physical disabilities want rehabilitation and people with psychiatric disabilities want rehabilitation, does this disparity have to exist? And that it no longer does, obviously, and that wall is starting to come down. That wall that divides people with disabilities is starting to come down. And wielding that wrecking ball are people in both groups who have come together and advocated for people being treated decently, humanely, people having the opportunity for rehabilitation, no matter what their disability name. And I say that leading this demolition effort is people such as the late Justin Dart, who brought us the Americans with Disability Act. So this wall is starting to come down. But for most of the last 100 years, the walls that separated people with psychiatric disabilities from other people, including people with physical disabilities, were very concrete, very obvious, very tangible. They were the walls of the state mental health institution. That's what separated people in those days. And the locked doors, the fences, etc. Very obvious how people were walled away from each other in life. And they were also walled away from each other in death, because the state institutions, as we now know, thanks to the work of some advocates, have unmarked cemeteries, deserted grave sites, etc. So people with psychiatric disabilities were walled away both in life and in death from folks. But I don't want to talk about that wall today, because that would be too easy. That's an easy wall, and we can all object to that. I want to talk today about the attitudinal walls that divide us, and speak today of the new walls we're once again building or mending without much thought, as Frost would say, to what we're walling in and out. I want to speak about these attitudinal walls, both in the community in which we live and in our treatment settings. And these walls, if left standing, can be as daunting to recovery as the walls of the institution. One wall I wish to speak about today is the wall that prompted me to label this the decade of the person, this decade, the decade of the person. A wall which I mentioned in my earlier remarks concerning the area of the body part. It is a wall of importance we have erected around our biological brains. People with severe mental illness are considered alliteratively to have a broken brain. In so labeling, we have elevated the brain to prominence as if by solving the mysteries of the brain-behavior relationship, recovery breakthroughs would commence. Would that it were so easy, and would that it would be so. But it really isn't. And I'll quote myself here in terms of something I said, and that's one of the advantages of having a speech written out. You can quote yourself. So quoting myself, I said, when the appeal of studying brain-behavior relationships becomes too reductionistic and singular in its appeal to scientific objectivity, it seems in more ways than one a mindless pursuit, and the pun is intended there. We seem to have forgotten the power of the person to impact not only his or her brain, but also his or her ability to learn, develop, and recover. And I just add a footnote here. It's the person and not the person's brain that must be our focus in the decade of the person. Now, speaking personally, I have seen pictures of my own brain. I have seen MRI pictures. Not everybody has. I have seen pictures of my own brain. And I want to tell you something about that experience as the neurologist was putting up the pictures, you know, on that thing in the wall that lights them up and shows the brain. He's putting the pictures up, and I kept looking at him and looking at him. I say, I didn't recognize myself, all right? You can't recognize yourself when you see your brain. You say, well, where's my life? Where are my loves? Where's my career? Where are those things? They aren't very obvious at all. A half a century ago, a great physicist of our time, Heisenberg, warned us about the dangers of explaining concepts of the mind, of the soul, and of life itself as a physical and chemical brain process governed by natural laws completely determined by causality. Heisenberg warned us about that, and I saw it firsthand when I looked at the pictures of my own brain. You couldn't explain me by looking at what was there. So our noble pursuit to understand the function of the brain, and it is a noble pursuit, but it must not divert us from the equally important task of understanding the workings of the person. We must tear down the wall that divides the brain from our mind, and that walls us away from the fact that our life experiences and what we make of them can change not only ourselves, but our brains. When I look over the field today, I see another wall standing that one would think would have fallen a long time ago. And it's the wall that separates the professional practitioner from the people they're trying to serve, people with psychiatric disabilities. This wall continues to be a very strong wall, and it's buttressed in many spots by traditional mental health thinking. Fortunately, there are now gaps in this wall, as Frost would say in his poem, that even two can pass abreast. But our actions often, again quoting Frost, set the wall between us once again. Unfortunately, two of the ways we have been rebuilding this wall or mending this wall are as follows. We continue to have this belief that healthcare technology is more important than the healthcare relationship. And secondly, we continue to believe and think that people with psychiatric disabilities cannot make choices, useful choices, and we need to make them for them. First, let me address the issue of the healthcare relationship. We act as if the practitioner's knowledge and technology are more important than the relationship between the practitioner and the person being served. And we know this is not the case, and we know this from listening to what people tell us, to what people with disabilities tell us. When asked, the majority of people who are recovering from a disability and from severe mental illnesses will mention that a critically important part of their recovery was, in fact, the people who related to them. They contributed. They listened to them. They believed in them. They supported them in numerous ways. So that when you ask people, they say it's other people that are the most important. And this fact was brought back to me or I guess occurred to me again in a very interesting way. I was at my healthcare plan several months ago and was waiting for the doctor who was inordinately late, and there's nothing new there. All right, so I'm wandering around wondering what to do. And I went out in the hall, and on the wall, and I don't mean a figurative wall, I mean a real wall here, out on a wall were comments that people who were patients at that particular healthcare plan wrote. And they were asked to write comments about, well, what was helpful to you? What did you find most helpful? What would you like to comment and compliment our staff on? And there must have been on this wall, there must have been about 50 pieces of note paper that patients had filled out what was most important to them, what they wanted to comment on. And when I looked at those, I had, as I said, plenty of time. There must have been about 50 of them. I read them all. So I'm standing there reading them all. People thought I was rather strange, I think, just standing there reading these things. But I was, because I was struck by the fact that the first few I read talked about the healthcare relationship. They didn't talk about the healthcare technology. They talked about the relationship. They talked about people, and they said the doctors encouraged me, or the medical people or the nursing staff humored me, they listened to me, they attended to me. On and on I went. I kept reading and reading and reading all of these. Only one of them mentioned a technical aspect of the interaction. Everybody else mentioned the interpersonal aspect. That one person, I wrote it down here, said, when Dr. So-and-so did the procedure, it didn't hurt like I thought it would. Other than that, everybody mentioned the interpersonal parts of the relationship. And this was in an environment that was primarily treating people with physical illnesses. The relationship, and not the technology, was what people focused on when they're asked what was most helpful. We need to remember that. I have always maintained that the primary source of our learning is not our books and our theories, but the people we serve and their families. And when given the opportunity, either by their words or their actions, they are trying to help us be better practitioners. The people we serve are trying to help us be better practitioners. And a lesson only people with disabilities can teach is that people with disabilities are first and foremost people, and not cases or diagnoses. Now, I learned about people with disabilities from a number of friends I had growing up who did have disabilities, but especially from one of my closest friends, Bob. And Bob had a significant disability. He had a significant disability. He was born without any arms or legs. He had one kind of 2-foot-long appendage that was like a leg, had 3 toes on it. It was probably about that long. Bob was a very good friend of mine. He visited me at college, stayed overnight, got my dorm mates to contribute their pillows. We put the pillows on the floor. Bob's bed was the pillows. Came to my wedding, graduated cum laude from college, and was a co-counselor with me at a summer camp. And Bob taught me about people with disabilities more so than any textbook ever did. He taught me by his actions that important lesson that people with disabilities are people first who like to laugh, love, live, learn, etc. Well, I have many fond stories about Bob, and because he was such a powerful influence on my life. And I want to tell you one of them that just kind of is an example of how, by his actions, he was just like anybody else, and you thought of them that way, as just a person, not a disabled person. Bob could swim, and at the summer camp, he would go swimming, and you would carry him in the water and set him down, he would float on his back. He could just float for hours, he could float. Well, at the start of every summer, Bob would say to me, well, let's go, and this was at the beginning of the summer, he says, let's go in the water and have some fun. And I knew exactly what Bob was up to. What we would do together is I would carry him in the water, you know, held him around like this with your arms around his chest so he could see. He didn't like to float, he couldn't see anybody. So you'd hold him and walk around. We'd always walk around, we'd find a new counselor. And we go up to that new counselor, didn't know much about Bob, didn't know who he was, and probably saw that, my God, this is a guy without arms or legs. Well, we went up to this new counselor, and we engaged that new counselor in conversation, and after a little while I'd say, you know, I got to go back up on the beach for a second. Could you just stay here with Bob while I'm gone? And the person would kind of look and say, well, okay. Didn't want to call attention to themselves. And I would back off from the person I was leaving with Bob in my arms. I'd kind of hoist Bob up about like this, and I'd throw Bob at the person. Well, obviously, he was fairly heavy, and he would sink. He'd sink right at the person's feet. And it was a very sandy lake, so he'd be down at the bottom. He couldn't see the bottom. And so the person would say, I can't find him, I can't find him. And I'd yell back, you were supposed to watch him, you were supposed to watch him. And then I would pretend to help try and find him on the bottom, move around, etc. And of course, I knew that in about 30 seconds, Bob would float to the surface, blowing a stream of water out of his mouth for punctuation. And the person would all of a sudden realize that a practical joke had been played on them. People with disabilities can do a lot of things, and they can even do practical jokes. And it just Bob had such an influence on me in my life. And I really think that you can't forget as a professional, as a practitioner, especially in this decade of the person, that people with disabilities, no matter how labeled, keep telling us the same thing. People are people who enjoy relationships with other people. And to borrow from a recent American political slogan, you remember, it's the economy, stupid? Well, the slogan here is, it's the people, stupid. And we can't forget that. We can't forget that. There's another area that divides people, another wall that kind of divides people from one another, divides professionals from the people that we're trying to serve. And that is our belief that people with disabilities, psychiatric disabilities especially, can't make useful choices. And at times this is like a virtual wall because you can't see it as much anymore because people are less apt to admit to this. But it's there. It's almost like a glass wall, and the only reason you know it is when you walk into it, it hurts. And it explains sometimes a lot of professional behavior, poor professional behavior, because they don't really believe choices can be made, so we have to do a lot of silly things. We take choice away from people with psychiatric disabilities for their own good. At least that's the saying. When in fact we usually do it for our good, the good of the professional. For example, if we can force someone into some program or setting, then we don't have to worry about making that setting more appealing or useful. They have to go. The pressure's off us to change it. Also, we blame the victim. Rather than ourselves or our programs, when they don't attend the program or use the service, we ourselves would probably never use. And in this case, if people aren't forced to go, they'll choose with their feet. And if they're not allowed to choose with their mouths, and they'll walk out. And the program will have tremendous attrition rate. Lastly, if people with disabilities are allowed to choose, they may request something that the program doesn't offer. And then we have a real problem, because it's very hard to change professional behavior or the program itself. Matter of fact, it's probably harder to change that than it is the person being served. So we have a lot of reasons why we don't really believe in this choice, in this idea of choice. But the fact is that choice is the motivator. Choice is the motivator. The human side of choosing one's own goal is what often gets people going. Benjamin Mays has said this best, and I quote him often. He said this: "It must be borne in mind that the tragedy in life does not lie in not reaching your goal. The tragedy in life lies in having no goal to reach for. It isn't a calamity to die with dreams unfulfilled, but it is a calamity not to dream. It is not a disgrace to not reach the stars, but it is a disgrace to have no stars to reach for." And today it's fashionable, and you've probably heard this when people argue for inpatient or outpatient commitment, you hear them say that the removal of choice and forced into programs is important because people are dying with their rights on. Maybe some of you have heard that expression. But I would also say that people are both living and dying with their dreams turned off. And we cannot be seen as the field, that walls people away from their choices and their dreams. There's this wall of non-choice is called sometimes you think you got a choice, but you really don't wall. And it's apparent to me in how we treat people, most apparent to me in how we treat people who are homeless and people with psychiatric disabilities. And it really struck me some time ago when we were trying to do a program in New York City for people who are homeless and street dwelling and mentally ill. And I worked with Sam Simperis, Dave Shern, both of who were at this conference. Worked with them on this program. And we called the program, or we didn't, the program was named by the people who were being served by the program as Choices. They called it Choices. And it was a program for people with psychiatric disabilities, as I said, who are homeless, street dwellers in New York City. We ran into a little bit of a problem because, as you know, that the mission statement we often use in rehabilitation when we talk about housing is to help people become successful and satisfied in their living environment of choice. Well, in order to fit the research requirement, we were supposed to house people. And if we just said, well, we're going to help them in terms of their living environment of choice, then if they chose to live on the streets or in shelters, then we would have to honor that choice. Whereas the research group and funding agency says, no, that's not a choice. That's not an acceptable outcome for this particular program for which we're giving you money. Well, we already had the money, so we decided to keep honor the psychiatric rehabilitation mission, talk about living environment of choice, and if people weren't ready to move off the streets at that time, well, there were other things that we could be helpful with. And our belief was that eventually they would, in fact, probably wish to move off the streets and enter housing. But it was a problem for us right at the beginning in terms of the outcomes that were expected, because the outcomes that were expected were the outcomes of the research agency rather than the outcomes that maybe some of the people wanted to pursue. So this whole area of homelessness in America, I think, is our biggest failure of the decade, and we continue to wall people out. We continue to wall people out who are homeless. And it's interesting, if when people with disabilities say, well, you know, I'd really like a job, we try and help them get a job. We try and work on them, work with them on getting a job. When people with disabilities want treatment, for the most part, we try and help them get treatment. But in contrast, when people who are disabled and homeless want a home, what do? We get them a case manager. We don't get them the home. And it's just amazing how we've come to treat people in America who are homeless. You know, the wall used to be around the institution. People were housed in the institution. Now the wall is around people who are homeless and in the community. And it's interesting, it's because we don't see the people as people. The prejudice and discrimination is the same whether you're housed in an institution or whether you're housed somewhere on the streets. It's where you're housed that becomes your defining characteristic, not the fact that you're a person. Frost depicts the farmers in this poem, and he describes kind of their primordial ways in dealing with what we in America call the homeless problem. He has a good description of it. He says, when he's seeing the farmers building this wall, and he's looking at one farmer, he says, I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only, and shade of trees. And I think we have to ask ourselves, by walling people out who are homeless and have psychiatric disabilities, what darkness have we walled in around ourselves and our society? Well, there are some other walls going up. I'm going to mention one more, I think. I see a new wall going up. It's a conceptual wall, I guess. It's called the evidence-based practice wall, whose construction is built on the very sensible notion that service delivery must be based on research. In other words, you want to have the services that research has shown to make a difference. Indeed, who amongst us could argue against this concept of evidence-based practices? And the evidence-based practice builders have already designated certain programs as meeting the test of evidence-based practice, that is, having some randomized clinical trials that shows that their particular program is better in terms of outcome than a alternative program or no program at all. ACT, supported employment, are examples of these practices. Now, if this is such a useful concept, why do I characterize it as a wall? And the reason being, I think this whole idea of evidence-based practice is very premature. This wall is going up way too fast, much faster than the available data would suggest. Some people are using this concept of evidence-based practices to wall practices out, rather than figure out what can be learned from existing practices that have some data but have not made it over the randomized clinical trial wall. In contrast, this field was built on bringing things in, this field of psychiatric rehabilitation, not walling it out, by working beyond the existing walls, so to speak. The ACT program, Stein and Test, were great examples of that. They built on what we knew and not just how we knew it. All right? They had a different vision, Stein and Test, the developers of the ACT program years ago. They had a different vision for their time. They said people could be treated in the community. Their program was not developed based on randomized clinical trials. It was developed based on their unique vision, just like the vision of recovery. So for an evidence-based practice to exist in this period of recovery, in this decade of the person, the evidence-based practice must identify outcomes that are related to recovery. And so far, all we've identified in these evidence-based practice programs are outcomes such as reduction of relapse, reduction of symptoms, creation of dead-end jobs. These aren't recovery types of outcomes. These aren't recovery outcomes where we talk about meaningful work, self-esteem, empowerment, improved quality of life. Those are the recovery outcomes. And so far, we have not been able to demonstrate very well that particular programs that have been designated as evidence-based practices really bring about these type of outcomes. They were really developed in a time when our vision was different. We didn't have a vision of recovery at that point, and these practices were developed. When the vision becomes outdated, then the research also becomes outdated. Interestingly, much of the knowledge base that we really have right now was not created by randomized clinical trials. For example, some of the knowledge that is fundamental to our field. We know there's a lack of correlation between skills and symptoms. We know that people can and are recovering. We know it's hard to generalize from the institution to the community. We know the importance of the helping relationship. All of these facts, all of this data was not based on randomized clinical trials, or is not what we would call evidence-based practice. So we might need to take this wall of evidence-based practice and lay it down, tip it over, and just see it as one of the highways to knowledge. It's just one of the highways to knowledge, the way to know, one of the ways of knowing. And it exists there with other ways of knowing, like observational studies, correlational studies, surveys, etc. And indeed, it is these ways of knowing, observational studies, surveys, correlational work, that have really allowed the evidence-based practice wall to be built at all. Now, in the text, you're going to find, if you ever get a hold of this text, you're going to find more on evidence-based practice. I'm skipping over that now and want to get to a last point here. Frost concludes his poem, Mending Walls, with the following lines. At the end of the poem, he's talking about the other person that's building this wall, and he says, "He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors." I mean, it's just a pronouncement, one of those pronouncements that we take such satisfaction in, good fences make good neighbors. Well, in our field, unfortunately, we have a lot of pronouncements that have retarded the growth of our field. For over 30 years, I've heard a lot of these pronouncements that have really served to divide us. They've really served to divide us. These statements have kept us, both helper and service recipient alike, from being the people we can be. They have walled in our attempts to be innovative. They have walled out our attempts to be inclusive. Pronouncements masquerading as fact have allowed us to hide behind the wall of inaction and the status quo. And I wish to close with some of the most outrageous statements I've heard in the last 30 years. And I've kind of categorized them chronologically a little bit to give you an idea. Well, maybe we're not saying these so much anymore. Others are currently quite in vogue. Some of the early pronouncements I used to hear, and I hear less today, but they rank up there with good fences make good neighbors, is people with severe mental illnesses are sick. They are not people with disabilities. People can't live in the community. People can't learn skills if they're symptomatic. People cannot be successful in real work or school environments. These were just things that were said routinely. Later on, we have these pronouncements, some of which are still used, I think, by some folks. Statements such as, people can't make realistic choices. People need ongoing, continuous, long-term care. People can't recover. And then are the last group of statements that I think are very much in vogue still today. Statements such as, people can't leave homelessness without first receiving extensive mental health services. In other words, people can't be offered a home until they first receive some services. People need evidence-based practices in order to help them recover. People can't hold jobs that we think are too demanding. So we still have a lot of pronouncements that are still very much a part of our field, I think. And I hope when you hear these mythical pronouncements stated as fact, whether they're ones I just listed here or some new ones or other ones that maybe you've never heard before, nor I hope you'll destroy them and bury them. These traditional pronouncements are not consistent with the facts that hopefully many people heard at this conference. Let us work on destroying some walls the next several days, the next several years, the next several decades. Let's work on destroying some walls. Walls that have kept helpers and service recipients alike from being the persons they need and want to be. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, and particularly in this decade of recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We have a little bit of time left for some questions or comments if people would like to make them. I'll give you a minute to think. No? Okay. Well, with that, then I think that Bill's remarks have struck a chord with the people sitting here in the room, and it seems pretty clear. There is that within us that does not love a wall. So thank you for your attention, and I bid you good day.